Hello, welcome back to our study of the book of Mark. Mark just finished a series of stories showing Jesus' amazing power and authority. He could cast out a legion of demons from a man that no one could subdue. He could heal a woman that no doctor could cure. He could raise a child from the dead. And he did all of this with a simple word. Now, Jesus continues his journey and he heads to his own hometown of Nazareth. So our scripture today is Mark 6, verses 1 through 6a. And it says, Jesus left there and went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. "Where did this man get these things?" they asked. "What's this wisdom that has been given him? What are these remarkable miracles he's performing? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own home." He could not do any miracles there except lay hands on a few sick people and heal them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. Earlier in the book of Mark, Mark had told us that Jesus' mother and brothers had come to get him. Remember when he had been teaching and healing and they wanted to come and tell him to go home with them. They wanted to get control of him and take him home. Well, now Jesus actually goes home. So these are his people. This is his family. This is the community where he grew up. He had spent the majority of his life in Nazareth as part of this community. We don't really think about that much with Jesus. We think about his ministry, but that ministry was 3.5 years. But from the time they came back from Egypt until he began his ministry, he lived in Nazareth. So Jesus actually spent the great majority of his life living in the community of Nazareth, and working as a carpenter. And in those days, a carpenter wasn't exactly like they are today. They did do woodwork, but the Greek word that is translated as carpenter is tekton, and it really refers to a multi-skilled builder and woodworker. So he could probably do also like simple buildings, repairs, a little bit like a handyman, and that he could fix a lot of things, but he also worked with wood. So he could be like fixing a roof, doing the beams in the roof and, carving the beams, making those, and then building the roof. He could have been making plows or yokes for oxen out of wood. He could have been building a stable or even making furniture, tables, chairs, all those type of things out of wood. So he was multi-skilled. The point I'm making is that he was a multi-skilled laboring guy, a guy who worked with his hands. He was a working man for most of his life, not unlike a construction worker today, a skilled construction worker who might have skills to do a variety of jobs. And so if you can imagine, we think of Jesus as this very intellectual person, but people didn't get that sense from him. Instead, what they saw was a construction worker. So he was more like a construction worker than like an ivory tower intellectual. And he lived most of his life in the village of Nazareth. He'd probably done jobs for half the village, repairing the roofs or fixing their furniture. And so now this guy, the guy who's lived there, the guy who's been kind of the town handyman, the town construction worker, comes in and he begins to teach in the synagogue, and he's done some miracles, and he's very impressive. And the people are like, wait a minute. You're telling me that the guy who fixed our roof is a prophet? You're telling me that the guy who fixed our roof is teaching in the synagogue? Oh, and his teaching's better than the rabbis? How'd that happen? I mean, stay in your lane, am I right? I mean, where does he get off thinking he's a teacher? Now, you might feel that way too if all of a sudden your handyman started teaching you philosophy or something else that you would expect from something else. And so here they are. This is their attitude towards Jesus. They're like, what? He performs miracles too? Now, are we talking about the same guy here? Mary's son, James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon's brother? That guy? Him? That's the guy that comes in thinking he's a prophet and he's doing these things? I mean, where's he getting this from? Where's he getting these ideas? Where's he get this knowledge from? He didn't go to Harvard. He didn't go to rabbi school. He's a construction worker. He's our neighbor. We've known him his whole life. We know his family. And so they didn't really give much credit to him. I mean, they're like, what? This guy? I think my cousin's married to his sister. So Jesus couldn't do anything for them. They were so critical of him that only a few people were healed. They'd been amazed at his teaching, but he was amazed at their lack of faith. Now, this is actually one of my favorite stories in the Gospels because I just see so much humanity in it. I think we can relate to this story very easily. And it also gives us a picture of what Jesus' life was like that's different from what we traditionally see. We don't really think of Jesus as having a family. The Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot about his childhood, just, a couple of stories here and there. And this passage kind of gives us a glimpse into what his life was like before his public ministry. We see Jesus was not an only child. He grew up in a home with brothers and sisters. And could you imagine Jesus being your big brother? Try to live up to that, right? So Jesus has 4 little brothers, James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. James, sometimes some translations say Jacob. But the thing about it is that his brothers, they all have these common names. So you're like, man, I think I've seen how come there's so many Judases? How come there's so many Simons? Like Joseph. Well, they're actually named after Jewish heroes and patriarchs. Of course, Joseph was one of the great heroes of the Old Testament. If it's Jacob, one of the patriarchs, right? He's the father. He's the one who got his name changed to Israel. He's the father of Israel. Judas and Simon were Maccabees who had led revolts and had made Israel to be its own independent country during the time of the Maccabees. And so his family valued their Hebrew roots, their Hebrew history, and so they celebrated. And so they probably were a fairly religious family, or at least very involved in the stories of Israel. And we see that Jesus wasn't a weakling. He was a skilled worker. I mean, he had callous hands and sunburned skin from hours of labor. He was strong, probably could carry, heavy things. So he wasn't this effeminate, very dainty person that like we see oftentimes portrayed in old paintings and in other forms of media. He was a hard-working, common man, construction worker, and that's what he did the majority of his life. So now put yourself in his neighbor's shoes. What if this construction worker guy that you've known all your life, your cousin's married to his sister, all of a sudden shows up and he's teaching about God and healing people? You might be skeptical too. I would be. And the truth is that it's usually easier for us to learn from some expert out over there than from the person that we've known all along. Maybe that's why so many people today listen more to the guy they see on YouTube than they do to their own pastor who lives in their community and invests in them. Yes, I realize that I'm talking to you on YouTube, but I would tell you, listen to your pastor. Be loyal to your pastor who invests his life in you. Don't overlook him the way these people, these neighbors overlooked Jesus, because God has put him there. There would also be some jealousy. It's common to hear of people whose families want them to stay where they are and not go out and take risks. I have a friend, he wanted to be a missionary in Asia, and his family was angry at him over it. Like, Where do you get these crazy ideas? Who do you think you are to go preach in Asia? Do you think you're better than us? I mean, you're from here. You're just a young guy from Texas. He did go to Asia, by the way, and he was pretty successful. And his family got along later. They got on board. But we build these boxes. We construct boxes for people that we know, and we want them to stay in their place in the boxes we've constructed. We don't want them to go out and do more or be more successful. But the thing is that when Jesus comes into your life and when you come to follow Jesus, he takes you to places that you wouldn't believe, that you couldn't imagine. He does things in your life that you wouldn't imagine. Think about the disciples. These guys were all going through life, working their jobs, and all of a sudden they followed Jesus, and their lives are changed. He calls them to follow him, and they lay down their nets. They follow him. Matthew leaves the tax collection booth and follows Jesus. And where do they end up? They end up all over the world preaching the gospel, getting executed for their faith, which I admit doesn't sound so exciting to us, but Jesus changed their life and they ended up going places and doing things they would have never imagined. And when you come to Jesus, he will do things in your life and take you places far beyond what anyone can imagine. I think about my own parents. They were from a small town in Oklahoma. My dad was a farm boy, but God called him. He followed the Lord into ministry, and eventually God called him into missions, and this Oklahoma farm boy is preaching in South America in a Native American language. Now, fortunately, in the case of my parents, their families were more supportive of them than Jesus's was. But when you follow Jesus, you just don't know where he's going to take you. And often those who knew you before won't like the change. They'll be jealous, and they might be blind to the message of Christ that you have for them. Now we can understand why Jesus said that his true family were those who obeyed the will of God. When you follow Jesus, you become a member of a new family. And even if your family rejects you, you belong to the family of God, to the church, the body of Christ. And like his neighbors, sometimes people who grew up around the church will have the hardest time seeing Jesus and accepting him for who he is. We let all of the baggage of the community get in the way of seeing who God is and what he has for us. So I can understand the townspeople, but they don't have an excuse. They should have been the first to celebrate Jesus. And perhaps that's why Jesus is amazed at their lack of faith. They should be the first to support Jesus and cheer him on. But that's not always the case. Don't let familiarity keep you from seeing God and experiencing his greatness. And don't be afraid to let Jesus change your life, even if people are saying, hey, you need to stay in the box.